Today's guest is Dr. Bryan W. Van Norden. He is the James Monroe Taylor Chair in Philosophy at Vassar College, Chair Professor in the School of Philosophy at Wuhan University. I love Wuhan, by the way. Van Norden has published 10 books on Chinese and comparative philosophy. He has done a video lecture series on Chinese philosophy, which is freely available online, and is a TEDx video, and wrote the TEDx video on Confucius, which has over 1 million views. He is a recipient of Fulbright, National Endowment for the Humanities, and Mellon Fellowships. Professor Van Norden has been honored as one of the best 300 professors in the U.S. by the Princeton Review. Welcome to the Bridge.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, really excited to have you here. I wanted to ask you about China, which is what we do here. So you studied philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania for your BA and a PhD from Stanford University, both in philosophy. But at what point did your interest in China emerge?
Well, I'm part of the generation that got excited about China when it opened up under Deng Xiaoping. In my high school, there was kind of a focus in social science and learning about China because people could see that China was going to be increasingly important in the international stage. To be really honest with you, another factor was the Kung Fu craze that was started by Bruce Lee's film Enter the Dragon. I thought that was pretty cool. So I was a little bit interested in China already when I went to college, but my plan in college was to major in philosophy, but then go to law school and become an attorney. So in my first year at college, it turned out I had space in my schedule to take first year Chinese. So I took modern Chinese while I was studying philosophy, still with this plan about becoming an attorney. And then my philosophy professor said, you know, you're really good at this. You might consider a career as a philosopher. And I said, well, I'm also interested in China. Maybe I could do Chinese philosophy. And my philosophy professors told me quite confidently that there is no such thing as Chinese philosophy. And when I talked to my sinology professors, my professors who taught me Chinese and Chinese history and Chinese civilization, they said, well, philosophy is a stupid discipline. You should become a historian or a sociologist or something serious like that. And then I had this naive idea. In retrospect, I can see it's naive, but it sounded like it made sense at the time. I thought, well, why don't I become a philosopher who specializes in Chinese philosophy? And there's so few people who do Chinese philosophy, I'm almost guaranteed a job because who else will be able to do it? And so I went to Stanford. At the time, it was one of the 2 top programs in philosophy where you could study Chinese philosophy in a philosophy department. You can no longer do that at Stanford, unfortunately. But at the time you could. And I eventually discovered that the reason so few people teach Chinese philosophy is that there is a kind of systematic bias against teaching it in the discipline of philosophy. So it took me a long time to get a tenure track job, but Vassar College was open-minded and hired me, and I've taught there for most of the last 30 years.
Wow, I actually just had an adjunct assistant professor at Vassar come on the show a few weeks ago, so it's like a whole Vassar theme now. But you know, we were talking about this when we met recently, that in the university system in the United States, typically, if you go to the philosophy department, I have a minor in philosophy, you don't find any classes typically that are about Chinese philosophy, Japanese philosophy, Eastern philosophy, African philosophy. It's pretty much, Aristotle to Kant and Heidegger and everything in between from the West. So what I understand is that you are trying to redraw the lines in philosophy in the in the Western system of studying philosophy. How do we get there? What were the obstacles?
Yeah, so, well, when people in the West first learned about Chinese philosophy, they immediately admired it and recognized it as philosophical. The first translation into a Western language of the sayings of Confucius, which we now call the Analects of Confucius in English, and the Analects has the sayings and brief dialogues of Confucius and his immediate disciples. The first translation of this work into a Western language was done by Jesuits who had extensive exposure to Western philosophy as part of their training. And in the 17th century, they translated the sayings of Confucius into Latin under the title Confucius Sonorum Philosophus, Confucius the Chinese philosopher. And it wasn't just the Jesuits who were excited about Chinese philosophy. Leibniz, who's a standard figure on any history of early modern Western philosophy, was a deep admirer of Chinese philosophy and said their ethics was very superior to Western ethics. And he also believed that Chinese thinkers had anticipated him in developing binary arithmetic. Leibniz developed binary arithmetic, which is the basis of modern computers. So next time you use a computer, thank a philosopher. You're welcome. But Leibniz thought that the I Ching, the classic of changes, which tries to describe the structure of reality using collections of 6 lines, each of which is either broken or unbroken, basically zeros and ones. And Leibniz said, wow, this is a binary code. So initially, people were very enthusiastic about Chinese philosophy. And then, as my friend and colleague, Peter K.J. Park, details and documents in his great book, Africa, Asia, and the History of Philosophy, a major transformation with the thought of Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant certainly did not invent the pseudoscientific notion of white racial superiority, but he bought into it. And so Kant buys into this notion of white racial superiority, and in his lectures on anthropology, he hierarchically arranges the races and says the whites contain all talents and motives in themselves. And then he ranks other races beneath them, including the people of South Asia and the people of East Asia. And he says they'll never be capable of philosophy. People in Africa will never be capable of philosophy. Indigenous American people will never be capable of philosophy. And people forget that he said these things, but the reason we need to remember is that the later followers of Kant rewrote the history of philosophy textbooks, as Peter K.J. Park documents, and they wrote Africa and Asia out of the history of philosophy. And they redrew the map of the history of philosophy so that it was a line going back only to ancient Greece, which people had not thought was the origin of philosophy prior to this. And then it just yeah, I know. It's just the earlier theories of the origin of philosophy thought that philosophy, and this is in European philosophy textbooks, mind you, European philosophy textbooks prior to Kant generally suggested that philosophy began either in Africa with the Egyptians or in South Asia in Indian philosophy, and then it was brought to ancient Greece. But post-Kant, you get this story where all philosophy just starts in ancient Greece and then kind of stumbles more or less directly to Kant's transcendental idealism. So that's why today many people just take it for granted without argument that there is no philosophy in East Asia or South Asia or Africa or in the indigenous peoples of the Americas.
You know, it's really interesting you bring that up because one of the tasks that I do is I go out and I meet American students, especially university students who are visiting China. And the last 3 times I got into a deep conversation with an American who was visiting China, they told me they were Daoists. So it seems like the younger generation, at least, is starting to perceive the world radically differently from that of our own. On your website, which is bryanvannorden.com, you have a quote, one of 2, under your bio. Quote, within the 4 seas, all men are brothers. And I think the name is Zixia?
Zixia, yeah, disciple of Confucius, yeah.
This strikes me. Oh, so it's one of the 72 disciples. Yeah.
Yeah.
This strikes me as humanistic, like seeing we're all, like human family. So I wanted to ask, is there some element of global humanism underlying your choice to pursue a more full philosophical canon?
Absolutely. And so there's I think part of what motivates me is a general sense that all around the world, we have different customs, we have different languages, different religions, different nations, but fundamentally, we're all humans. And so it's always possible to understand, at least at some level, the perspective of other people. That's not suggesting that we can, I can completely understand what it's like to be Confucius living in a kind of early Iron Age aristocratic society. But he's a human being. And so at some level, I can understand the issues that motivate him. And so this is opposed to the view that races, and the whole notion of race is really kind of a fiction that was developed by imperialists in the 19th century. It's not a biological category. It doesn't track anything real. And so the notion that races are fundamentally different, or that there are these fundamentally incommensurable perspectives on the world from different cultures or different nationalities, I generally reject that and try to figure out how we can achieve a fusion of horizons, to use a phrase from the great philosopher Gadamer. He says that everything you do has significance only against a background, a horizon of meaning. But through dialogue, you can help understand gradually and help others to understand your background of significance and achieve a partial fusion of these horizons. And that can enrich your own perspective, or even help you understand better what is distinctive about your own perspective. So I'm trying to get us back to that ideal of cosmopolitan humanism that I think really animates philosophy. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to just add to that, because I think my own experience of studying just Western philosophy was that philosophers were overturning each other's ideas constantly, even if they were not commensurate with one another. That's almost the point sometimes. I mean, if you look at the theory of monads from Leibniz and you look at atomic theory now, they're nothing at all alike whatsoever. So it's almost like better to get completely radically different perspectives on what it means to be, right? I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. Going back to the university system, I read your book and you had some really excellent retorts to this assertion. Well, if people want to study Chinese philosophy, they can just go to the Asian Studies department. What's wrong with that argument?
Yeah, you sometimes hear that, and on the face of it, I could see why it might seem plausible. But the fact is that the reason we have different intellectual disciplines, like we've got a department of, say, East Asian languages and literatures, or we have a department of East Asian area studies, and we have a department of philosophy, is philosophers ask certain kinds of questions and read text in a distinctive kind of way. And so it's very rare that you actually find someone in a religious studies department or an East Asian languages and cultures department who is genuinely approaching texts like the sayings of Confucius or Taoist writings or one of the many other schools of Chinese philosophy in a genuinely philosophical way. And so there's a value to doing this in philosophy. Also, my friend and colleague Jay Garfield, who wrote the foreword to my book, Taking Back Philosophy, he has this great example. He said, it's kind of like if we said, oh, well, look, we're not saying that they don't have they don't have food in other cultures, but we have cuisines and they have fodder. So you can study what their fodder in the agricultural department, but we're only going to study the fine cuisines that we have, in the gastronomy department. That's kind of what it's like, saying like, oh, well, you don't need to study this in philosophy. Just study it in some other department because it can't hold its own against the high quality of Western philosophy. But in fact, when serious philosophers actually try to engage with Chinese philosophy, they find out it's really very deep and very powerful, and it can hold its own in dialogue with Western philosophy.
I think we all know the answer, but I have to ask the question. What about cultures beyond the West and China? What about universities teaching ideas from our brothers and sisters in Africa, Central Asia, what about the counter arguments that this is going to marginalize figures like Hegel, Hume, Lacan, and because there won't be enough space for everyone? How do you actually see a philosophy program in the future if you can repave the way?
Yeah, great question. I think that we really do need to expand the curriculum, and Chinese philosophy is just a part of East Asian philosophy. And sometimes I'll even just say South Asian philosophy instead of Indian philosophy, because there's more to South Asia than just India. And there's more to Indian philosophy than just the canonical Orthodox Indian schools. There's also Buddhist philosophy and Jain philosophy and other alternatives. And so I'd like to see a future in which we're interested in the African philosophy, Africana philosophy, which includes both African philosophy and also the philosophy of the African diaspora. So people of African descent who've done philosophy outside of Africa, people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., for example. And then the philosophy of the indigenous people of the Americas, which includes both like Mayan and Aztec philosophy, but also things like the philosophy of the Navajo people and other indigenous American people. There is a legitimate concern is, how can you cover everything? But the fact is that the philosophical curriculum and the canon has always been changing. So one of my favorite stories is a few years ago, this young, brash philosopher, came to a major European university, and he wanted to teach this non-canonical thinker. And people were upset about introducing this non-canonical thinker into the curriculum. Some people said, well, look, this just isn't part of our tradition. We teach our tradition. This is an alien tradition. Other people said, well, I guess we could incorporate it, but we need like a theory of two truths. There's like the truth within our tradition, and then there's the truth of thinkers like this who are outside of our tradition. And the thinker I have in mind, this brash young thinker who was challenging the canon, was Thomas Aquinas, who in the 13th century reintroduced Aristotle into the Western European curriculum at the University of Paris, now the Sorbonne. And at the time, people had exactly the same reaction to introducing Aristotle. They said, he's not part of our tradition. He's this weird pagan thinker, and there were people who had like a two truths theory. They said, well, we could only incorporate him if we said there were two kinds of truth. There's religious truth and there's philosophical truth. And people said, well, that's kind of crazy. Can't we just have a dialogue between Aristotle's ideas and the ideas that are already dominant in the curriculum? And Aquinas won, and because of that, the canon was deeply enriched. So the canon's always been in flux. It used to be that if you studied philosophy, you had to study Cicero. Cicero was central to the Western philosophical curriculum. So was Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy. There's nothing wrong with reading Cicero or Boethius, but it would hardly be the end of end of the world when we stop teaching those guys. So the curriculum is always in flux. And the curriculum in philosophy that I was raised on was really a product of a particular moment in especially English language, Anglo-American philosophy, when people had agreed about a certain conception of philosophy that was centered around philosophy of language, epistemology, and mind-body problems in metaphysics. And so when I was learning philosophy, we agreed on the canon because there was this dominant conception. But that conception isn't dominant even among mainstream philosophers anymore. And as you say, students are very excited to learn about Confucianism and Daoism. For some of them, this is part of understanding what they consider their own intellectual heritage. For some of them, it's about understanding one of the most powerful economies and nations in the world and its government, that of China. And for still other people, it's just genuine intellectual curiosity. So yes, some things are going to move out of the canon. When I was studying philosophy, Willard Quine and Davidson everybody in American philosophy knew those guys. And I find they're increasingly marginalized even among mainstream thinkers. So the canon's always evolving. And I think in many ways it's going to be a very exciting period in philosophy as we incorporate these new philosophical figures into the curriculum.
What universities, because you had some of the numbers when I was asking you, what are some of the universities in the United States, at least, that are already starting to incorporate non-Western thinkers into their philosophical curriculums, and how are they doing it?
Well, in, I think it was 2016, Jay Garfield and I published an op-ed in the New York Times called "If Philosophy Won't Diversify, Let's Call It What It Really Is." And this op-ed stemmed from a quip that Jay Garfield made where he said, look, if philosophy departments are not going to teach any philosophy outside the Anglo-European mainstream, let's just call them departments of white boy philosophy. And our editor at the time said, well, you can't say white boy philosophy. Like, well, okay, change them. They should change their names to departments of Western philosophy or European philosophy, because that's really all they are. And we said, of course, we'd prefer that they opened up the curriculum, but if they're not going to do it, just be honest about what you're doing. And at that point, there was like in between, say, it depends on how you count them, but like 10 and say 13% of doctoral programs in philosophy in the United States had anybody on staff who could supervise a dissertation on, say, Chinese philosophy. That is pretty stagnant. Right now, it's about 13%. And there's no Ivy League university that has someone in the philosophy department who could supervise a doctoral dissertation on Chinese philosophy. It's just absolutely stunning. And Indian philosophy, in some ways, there are even fewer options if you want to study Indian philosophy in a philosophy department. I'm happy to say that both Harvard and Columbia University do have someone in the philosophy department you can study Indian philosophy with, but the total number of institutions at which you can get a doctorate in Indian philosophy is even fewer than in East Asian or Chinese philosophy. And when it comes to, it's hard to count, there's both African philosophy and Africana philosophy. And so it's harder to know how to count those. But again, very few departments have specialists in African philosophy. And indigenous philosophy, indigenous American philosophy, last time I checked, it was, I think, 2 doctoral programs where you could study indigenous American philosophy in a philosophy department. And this is in a world that is increasingly multipolar, increasingly multicultural. You could maybe make a case for just studying Western philosophy in the early part of the 20th century, when it seemed like, the United States was, going to dominate the free world. But it's a complex, multipolar world now, and the United States is a multicultural country. So we have to make philosophy something other than a temple to the accomplishment of white males.
Well, it looks like you have your work set out in front of you. One of the things that enabled me to come to China and see China better for what it is, as opposed to some of my colleagues that came out here with me, is that I studied cultural anthropology, which says if you're going to go somewhere, you need to take on their characteristics and think like them, behave like them. I don't, but I think I did a better job of it than some of the people I know. This is there's a professor at UC Berkeley, Wendy Brown. She wrote a book, Regulating Aversion, where she talks about the U.S. idea of tolerance. And in this idea, she's basically, we pride ourselves on being tolerant when even the word tolerant basically means there's an aversion there, that what they're doing over there, we don't like it, but we'll put up with it because we're good Americans and we're tolerant. And so when we were at the 10th Nishan Forum on Global Civilizations in Chufu recently, there were people from civilizations all over the world, mostly Chinese and Americans, but there were people from everywhere else also a little bit. And I kept interviewing people, including yourselves, and they were using words like celebration and appreciation of one another's cultures. What can be gained from celebrating? I mean, you've done this by studying Chinese philosophy. What can be gained by celebrating and appreciating other cultures and philosophies from around the world?
Well, I think what we learn just from the study of history is that people are enriched by engaging and celebrating other cultural traditions. So one expression people use is the Abrahamic traditions to refer to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which for all their differences are similar in that they all recognize Abraham as a great prophet. And each of these traditions, it grows originally independently of philosophy. But then when thinkers in each of these traditions encountered thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, who are genuinely alien to their indigenous traditions, they found that it enriched their understanding of their own traditions to think about them in terms of these new ideas they'd encountered. And as I said a moment ago, the knowledge of Aristotle was lost. Most of his works were lost in the Middle Ages in Europe, but they were preserved in the Islamic world. And so they were re-imported around the time of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. And that had a very positive transformative effect on the development of philosophy in the West. And I would say, ironically, I don't want to get too far afield on this, but people often make fun of Aristotle for things he got wrong about natural science. But the fact is, Aristotle's scientific theories were presented a paradigm and trying to work out how they would deal with certain problems like projectile motion led to the rise of modern science. And so sometimes even a theory that's wrong can be very useful if you can figure out, well, what's it wrong about and what are we going to have to come up with to go beyond it? So if there were no Aristotle, I don't think we'd have modern science. So likewise, in the modern world, we're at this situation where we can learn so much from other cultures. And one of the things I think is valuable learning from, say, Confucianism is what Confucianism tries to do is find like a middle path between recognizing that we're very dependent on others, both for our existence and even for the definition of who we are. So, for example, who am I? Well, I'm a teacher, I'm a father, I'm an American. Each of these is a relational property. I'm a teacher because I have students. I'm also a teacher because some brewer, Matthew Vassar, decided to use his fortune in the 19th century to make a women's college. Vassar's now coeducational, but he just had this idea. And so I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have a job if that guy had not decided to do that in the 19th century. I'm a father. Well, I'm a father because I have children. I'm an American. Well, because of all the other Americans and because of the people who founded our nation. So even our very identity depends on others. And Confucians recognize that. But then they say, well, but you also have to take into account that you are an individual with ties to particular other individuals. So I owe something to my parents for the sacrifices they made to give me opportunities they did not have. I owe something to my children because they're my children. They're not just a stranger's children. And I think this is actually a much more realistic view of what we are like as people than a lot of what we get in the West, which often takes this radically individualistic view where I owe you nothing, you owe me nothing. And as a result, why should I care about, whether or not you get sick from COVID? Why should I wear a mask, if I'm not worried about getting sick? Or, why should I have to pay taxes, to, pay for public schools if I don't have kids? Like, well, but because the people that you work with went to public schools and they benefited, because you drive on publicly funded roads to get to and from work. Because if it weren't for, public initiatives like vaccinating people against polio, you'd still be afraid of polio the way people in earlier generations were afraid of ending up in an iron lung. And so people forget, I think, because of Western radical individualism, how dependent we are on others. And so we're sometimes unwilling to make the usually very minor sacrifices that we're asked to make for the well-being of others. And so I think we can really learn a lot from this Confucian picture, which emphasizes both our individuality, but also our connection to others.
There's so many other questions I want to ask you related to that, but the show is limited. Maybe there'll be time at the end. I kind of want to pivot to Buddhism a little bit. Well, actually, and maybe come back to Confucianism about this as well. A lot of Americans think there's not really religion in China, that everyone over here is just a pure atheist communist or something like that. But, I think your experience is probably very rich. You've been to China many times. Does religion exist? What is Chinese Buddhism? Are there active temples here? And if so, what are their tenets?
Yeah, great question. I think it's funny. I have a picture of a street scene from Wuhan, and my wife actually blew it up into a poster because she was so amazed by it. It's just an ordinary street scene with some shops in Wuhan and like a dad walking with his kid. And her reaction was, "Is that what China looks like?" And I said, "Yeah, well, what did you think it looks like?" "Oh, I don't know. I didn't think it was like that." And I think a lot of Americans still have this impression that China is like some kind of Stalinist state with all these very drab, concrete buildings and people just, dressing in like, very drab clothing. And as you and I know, China is this vibrant, beautiful, exciting culture, and part of that vibrancy is, some people have very strong religious beliefs. And I know Chinese Christians, and I know Chinese Buddhists, and I visited Buddhist temples. So when I was, not this visit, but in a previous visit to Wuhan, my son came to join me, and we went to a beautiful Buddhist temple in Wuhan. And we went all the way to the top. There's a pagoda. You have this beautiful view of the city. And on the way back, we noticed that there was a Pure Land Buddhist ceremony going on where people will chant the name of Amitabha Buddha, thinking that it gives them merit. And we kind of peeked at it, but we didn't want to disturb. But the woman who was in charge of the service waved us over, and gave us a phonetic card showing us how to say Amitabha Buddha. And we walked around and participated in the ceremony. This is all happening in public. And so, no one's hiding this stuff. I think there's still a little bit of a leftover from earlier periods in Chinese history where there was some persecution of religions. And so some people aren't as religious because they've lost touch with a religious background. But I know lots of serious Chinese Christians and Chinese Buddhists, and they're perfectly comfortable practicing their religious beliefs and discussing them with other people. And so I think this is part of, like, people have a lot of misconceptions about China, and sometimes they're very heinous misconceptions, and other times they're just due to ignorance about what ordinary life is like in China.
Oh, okay. So you already kind of touched on Confucianism, and I think you did a good job, but I'm going to try to flesh out a little bit more. This is a big question. Is it a religion? Is it a philosophy? It seems to be a philosophy. As a Western person, I read Confucius and I'm like, okay, this looks like philosophy to me. But if I go to a Confucian temple, sometimes I will see mothers with their children, and their children are praying for good grades to Confucius. So is he more than a man?
Yeah. Well, the issue of whether Confucianism or Daoism or Buddhism is a religion or a philosophy is complicated. The distinction between religions and philosophy is one that developed gradually in the modern West because people wanted a way to classify things like Confucianism and Daoism. And so, but prior to that, there wasn't a really clear distinction between philosophy and, say, theology. So if you were going to be a theologian, you'd study a lot of philosophy, and that was just kind of like preparatory to being a theologian. But then later, people wanted to classify things like Hinduism or Confucianism or Daoism as a religion. And part of the reason for doing that was you could exclude them from philosophy departments. So the whole question of what's a religion as opposed to a philosophy is actually surprisingly a political one. The categories of science, religion, philosophy, those are very recent Western categories to distinguish those three activities. So certainly there are people who will pray to Confucius, and there's ways in which Daoism sometimes functions as a religion. So people will pray to, Lao Tzu or to other divinities in the Taoist pantheon. And there are Taoist priests, and there are Buddhist monks and nuns. Not so much like a Confucian priesthood. And usually when people, pray in a Confucian temple, as you point out, it's for good grades on exams. But I've been to Taoist temples where people will give offerings to try to get good fortune, or will get their fortune read, or you'll get blessed by a Taoist priest to help with your health. So there are religious practices like this, to be sure. But also there's this really deep philosophical tradition that you find in Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. And as I say, if you bring them into dialogue with Western philosophy, you find that they're similar enough to be recognizable as philosophical systems, but different enough to have something original to offer. So one example I give is there's a problem in Western philosophy called the problem of weakness of will, or in Greek they call it akrotia. And the problem of weakness of will is sometimes we know what the right thing is to do, but we don't do it. Or we know something is wrong, but we do it anyway. Mm-hmm. And so the reason this is a really kind of puzzling problem. Why does this happen? And it turns out that there's a lot of discussion of this in Plato and Aristotle, but there's also a lot of discussion of it in Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming, who are two, we could say broadly medieval, or if you want, Confucian philosophers. And I think the solution to the problem of weakness of will that Zhu Xi, this 12th century Confucian philosopher, gives is much more clear and much more plausible than the view that we get in Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics, although he spends an entire book in the Nicomachean Ethics wrestling with this. So this is just one of many issues on which Western philosophers could actually learn from Chinese philosophers if they try to engage with them.
After I wrote the question about Confucius, I was thinking about it also. And the solution I came up with is, in Japan, Korea, China, and other places, there's ancestor worship. And I think maybe the reason parents have their kids pray to Confucius might be related to that. Because typically people don't, even here, think of Confucianism as any kind of religion, because people who use English use our categories, the language that we gave them when we're speaking in English with them, to try to understand the world when they're talking with us, at least in English. And so when they use words like philosophy and religion, they typically talk about Confucianism as a philosophy as well. But I think it might be related to the fact that people pray to their grandparents that have passed away. Same kind of thing. I'm interested in Daoism, and it seems multifaceted to me. And I can see that it's also about physical health. I met a Taoist. His whole thing is it's all about physical health and Kung Fu, and that's his entire perception of it. There are some other Taoist temples that are much more like, Confucian temples. It's very philosophical in nature. But there's also the White Cloud Temple, which is very religious, and people are praying, like you said, to various divinities. So it's, it seems kind of not fitting into our categories that we've kind of created of religion and philosophy. You've probably studied it a great deal more than I have. Most of what I've read is just in this one single book, the Tao Te Ching, which I've read many times. From a philosopher's perspective, what lessons does Taoism teach? Or just a few of them?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I think is most insightful in particular about the Tao Te Ching, attributed to Lao Tzu, who was allegedly, as you know, a contemporary of Confucius, is oftentimes the effort to be moral is self-defeating. Because if we try to be moral, we have the wrong motive for being moral, and hence we will end up, instead of being righteous, will be self-righteous. And I think part of the reason you might find this plausible is just think about people you know who talk a lot about morality. How many of them, in your opinion, are really hypocrites? Or it's so often that the people who are talking about, we've got to get back to family values, and how come no one has character anymore, and then a week later you find out like they've got 5 mistresses and they've been bilking the organization they work for out of money, embezzling from it. And so the Tao Te Ching says, well, that's what happens, because if you try to be virtuous, you're probably doing it to impress other people, but that's the wrong motive for being virtuous. So that's a non-trivial, I think, objection to Confucianism, because Confucianism is very concerned with the effort to try to become a better person. Another thing that I think Daoism offers us is it tries to de-center the human perspective on the world by asking us, well, if we took the perspective of heaven, and when the Taoists talk about heaven, I'm always reminded there's this great expression from the Western philosopher Thomas Nagel. He wrote this great book called The View from Nowhere. The View from Nowhere. And he uses that phrase, the view from nowhere, to describe this ideal of trying to have a perspective that is not any individual perspective. It's the perfectly objective perspective. And Nagel is parodying that perspective. He says, well, you really can't take the view from nowhere. Any view you have is a view from somewhere. But because mathematics and natural science have been so successful, and they try as much as they can to abstract from individual subjective perspectives, we have this aspiration to take the view from nowhere in everything in life. And so what Taoists kind of do is, well, so what if we took the view from nowhere? What would our human practices and values look like? And so our human practices and values start to look pretty stupid if you take the view from nowhere. And so, you think all of us will do things like, we're all like this, like you want a promotion at work, or you want like a certain kind of social recognition, maybe a prize or an award or something. I have an endowed chair at Vassar. I'll just confess here, I ordered a plaque that goes on the door of my office that says Bryan W. Van Norden, James Monroe Taylor Chair in Philosophy at Vassar College. It's just so petty. And so the Taoists would say, well, from the perspective of heaven, if we take the view from nowhere, does it make any difference whether or not you've got a title after your name? It's kind of silly that you want that, isn't it? And if you're disappointed because you don't get a promotion or you don't get the job you want, what difference does that make from the perspective of the universe? You think 1,000 years from now, anyone's going to care about you or whether you got this promotion or not? So there's something kind of freeing about adopting that perspective where we just call into question all our views. Now, in fairness, I tend to be more of a Confucian. The Confucians, and this was part of Nagel's point in his book, The View from Nowhere, he said, there's a certain advantage in trying to take the view from nowhere, but at the end of the day, you're a particular individual with your own particular perspective, and there's nothing wrong with adopting your perspective on the universe as long as you recognize it's not the only one. And so it's okay that I love my children and I love my granddaughter. It's okay that I care about my own life history as long as I recognize there are a lot of other things in the universe besides that. That would be kind of the Confucian response to it. But I think there's a lot of depth to those Taoist ideas that you have to be careful that the effort to become a better person doesn't lead to hypocrisy or self-righteousness. And you have to be able to take this broader perspective, the view from nowhere, or the perspective of heaven, and recognize the comparative unimportance of the projects and goals that you perhaps take really seriously.
That's really insightful. One of the things I took away is if you're at the peak of, your career, it's going to go down. So like you're winning an Olympic medal right now, and you're holding your gold medallion in your teeth. That's fantastic. But life isn't going to be like that 5 years from now. So if you hit the bottom, also, it's probably going to get better. So I kind of like that cyclical nature of everything in Taoism. It's almost a relief, because you're like, okay, maybe I'm having a bad day, but tomorrow probably it's not going to be this bad. When I think about history, I put things in periods. So you have, Plato and Aristotle, Socrates are around the same time, within a few centuries, as Lao Tzu and Confucius. So is it fair to compare them, or are these because you said you can call it medieval because you were saying that it's not accurate. You were implying that it's not an accurate way to look at it because it's a different history. But is it fair to make these analogies? Oh, well, Confucius and Lao Tzu are the Plato and Socrates of China, or is it a meaningless analogy?
I think it's a helpful analogy as long as we don't take it too seriously. So, for example, one thing I tell my students, I said, look, if you want to have a structure to organize your understanding of thought on, you can divide intellectual history in many societies into 3 stages. So there's the stage where the classic canonical texts in the tradition get written. And so that would be the era where you've got the Analects of Confucius, the Tao Te Ching, the classic of the Way and Virtue attributed to Lao Tzu, the writings of the Confucians Mengzi and Shunzi, the writings of the Taoist Zhuangzi, the School of Names, the Moists, all the other ancient Chinese schools. And that kind of corresponds to the period when you've got the classic works of Plato and Aristotle being written, and Socrates inspiring Plato to write all these works. And this can in some ways compare in Indian philosophy to the period in which the canonical texts of the various schools of Indian philosophy are written, like the Nyaya Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita and the early sermons of the Buddha. Then, in many cultures, you'll see a long period where vibrant intellectual debate is conducted in the form of commentaries on the classics. And I think there's a bias in many people to think, oh, you don't want to read the commentaries. That's just people repeating what they said in the past. Anybody who reads commentarial traditions in any tradition knows that there are vibrant intellectual debates going on. So again, Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming, in many ways, these Confucians are framing their debate in terms of a commentary on an earlier classic, The Great Learning, but they're having a vibrant intellectual debate, not just repeating the past. So likewise, people like Augustine and Aquinas, the 2 greatest Christian philosophers, in a lot of ways, they're commenting on the Bible and Plato and Aristotle, but they're bringing them into dialogue in a really powerful, kind of vibrant way. Then the last stage is when cultures encounter modernity. And by encountering modernity, I mean modern natural science, capitalism as a distinctive economic system, and trying to figure out how do you relate these traditional systems of thought to this new modernity. And you get some people who say, well, part of modernity is we just have to reject the earlier traditions as a whole. So Nietzsche is an example of this kind of figure. He says, well, now we have to think in a whole new way, and we've got to throw away a lot of our earlier ideas. And then in China, you get thinkers in the mid-40s like Hu Shi, who are telling us to transcend these earlier Confucian, Buddhist, and Taoist ideas. Or you get Ambedkar in the Indian tradition. But then you also get kind of thinkers they think that if you understand tradition in the right way, it can still speak to modernity. So Gandhi, in many ways, in the Indian tradition, is kind of a neo-traditionalist. He says you understand the Gita the right way. It's very relevant to contemporary Indian politics. Or the new Confucians, people like Mo Zhongshan, Tang Junyi, said something similar about making Confucianism relevant for the modern world. And of course, you get thinkers like Descartes, who in many ways is the beginning of modern philosophy, but he's also kind of hearkening back to earlier thinkers like Augustine. And so there's a way in which Descartes is in some ways, a surprisingly traditional thinker. So now, if you take this three stages, classics, commentary, modernity, if you use that as like a really rigid system, it's worse than nothing. But if you use it as just kind of like a way of hanging your hat on something, or how am I going to organize all these ideas, it's kind of useful, I think.
For my next question, I feel like you kind of already answered it, because it's going to be what other philosophers exist in the Chinese canon that we may not already know about, and you've already listed a dozen. But for people who want to delve deeper than just Lao Tzu, Confucius, Mengzi, who would you recommend? Where should people start?
Well, you kindly mentioned at the beginning, I've got a lecture series on Chinese philosophy on YouTube that's freely available. Also on my website, bryanvannorden.com. I've got a section where I give you syllabi for teaching courses on Chinese philosophy, and also reading lists on various different philosophical traditions. But the third edition of Ivanhoe and Van Norden, Readings in Classical Chinese Philosophy, just came out.
Wow.
And in there, we have selections from Confucian texts like the Analects of Confucius, the Mengzi, the Shunzi. We've also got selections from the Moist writings. The followers of Mozi were the first major articulate critics of the Confucian tradition. We've got selections from the School of Names, which is a philosophical movement that was particularly interested in the philosophy of language. And I translated those selections, and it seems to me that the School of Names in China anticipated many issues in the philosophy of language that Western philosophers only began to really understand in the 20th century. So they were far ahead of their time. And then I think the Taoist philosophers, you mentioned Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching, but also Zhuangzi is a really great Taoist philosopher. In some ways, they're critics of Confucianism who are influenced by the philosophy of language that was developed by the School of Names. So we have selections from them. The legalist philosophers, we have selections from Shun Dao and Han Feizi, who are great legalist thinkers. And so that already gives you a sense of the wide variety of positions you can find in Chinese philosophy. And then there's a follow-on volume to that by edited by Tewald and Van Norden, Readings in Later Chinese Philosophy. And we start up with the Han Dynasty and some of the texts that people often think of as very characteristic of Chinese philosophy, like the I Ching, the classic of changes. We've got selections from that in this second volume, Readings in Later Chinese Philosophy. And then some of these thinkers we just mentioned, like Zhu Xi, Wang Yangming, later Confucian philosophers, and some selections from critics of the later of the entire tradition, like Hu Shi, who was a big fan of importing Western philosophy, and Mo Zongsan, who is one of the great new Confucian philosophers of the 20th century. So that those works will give you like an introduction in English to selections from some of the most interesting figures in the tradition.
And can you say the name of the book one more time?
Sure. So there's Readings in Classical Chinese Philosophy, edited by Philip J. Ivanhoe and Bryan Van Norden. And then there's Readings in Later Chinese Philosophy, edited by Justin Tewald and Bryan Van Norden, both from Hackett Publishing. And you can find them on Amazon, but there's also links to them on my website, bryanvannorden.com.
Fantastic. We just have enough time for one question, so I'm not going to be able to come back around to Confucianism as I was hoping to, unless you want to fit that into the answer. But there exists in media and politics sometimes a lack of understanding between the United States and China in our contemporary world, and others too around the world. So in the spirit of the Global Civilization Initiative, how can, for Americans, because we are Americans, learn about Chinese philosophy, and how might that bring about better understanding of modern China?
Well, Xi Jinping, the paramount leader of China, has said that the Chinese Communist Party is the true inheritor of the Confucian tradition and also the true protector of the Chinese tradition. And I talk a little bit about this in the chapter, Trump's Philosophers. Actually has a section on Xi Jinping in my book, Taking Back Philosophy. So one reason for learning about Chinese philosophy is to look at this movement that has been and continues to be very influential in China. But if I can just end on this point, I don't want to launch into conspiracy theories about what's going on in the world today. But when the U.S. was facing the Soviet Union, you had like a really ardent anti-communist Cold Warrior like Richard Nixon, who sat down and negotiated with the Soviets because he recognized that we need to find a modus vivendi, a way of living between these two superpowers. And you can't accuse Nixon of being soft on communism or soft on the Soviet Union, but he just recognized we need to sit down and negotiate with these people. We need to do the same with China, right? We can't treat China like we could push it around. It's another superpower, and we need to be willing to sit down and negotiate. And China has legitimate concerns about the fact that they have allies of the US just off their border in Japan, in the island of Taiwan, in the Philippines. And the US would not tolerate it if China had naval bases in Cuba and Mexico and, right off the coast of California. So we need to negotiate and treat other superpowers like superpowers, not treat them as someone we can just push around, because there's no reason a superpower should allow itself to be pushed around, and we wouldn't tolerate that if other nations did that to us. So I think we need to start thinking about China in those terms, the way we treated the Soviet Union. You don't have to agree with the Soviet Union or everything they do to realize it's a good idea to negotiate with them. Same thing about China.
Thank you so much for your time, Professor Van Norden. For people listening, you want to learn more about Chinese philosophy or more about the professor, you can find his website, bryanvannorden.com. Thank you again.
Thank you.